afternoon on this very rainy day in mid-December. Thank you for joining us for our December Lunch and Learn series. I want to start off by just taking a moment to gratefully acknowledge that our work at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute and the Women's Health Research Institute takes place on the unceded traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and learn on these sacred lands. I'm really excited for today's presentation by Julia Santana Perea, and I'm going to introduce her. Julia is a qualitative specialist at the Women's Health Research Institute with over 15 years of qualitative health research experience. Her practices have been informed by her work with communities in research, organizing, and storytelling capacities. So really excited for today's presentation. And before I turn it over to Julia, I just want to flag for everyone that there will be an opportunity at the end of her presentation to ask questions. But feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along. And Julia has also prepared some open-ended Slido questions at the end of the presentation. So please stay tuned for that. And with that, I'll turn things over to Julia.
Thank you, Shanley, and thank you all for joining me today. As mentioned, my name is Julia Santana Parrilla. Shanley, you did your very best.
I tried my best. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. I go by Julia in these circles, but my given name is Julia. And I'll be presenting Reflexivity and Relationality, facilitating embodied collaboration. So just a little something light to accompany your lunch today. So as an extension to the land acknowledgement provided by Shanley, I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the unceded territories ancestrally stewarded by the Musqueam, Squamish, Solo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I also want to address the reports on the screen here. Because as people who are working towards health equity and working within health institutions, I think it's important that we reflect on the roles that we have and our responsibilities to address some of the calls to action within the TRC report, specifically 18 to 23, that are dedicated to health. So those at the very least. Some of the recommendations from the In Plain Sight report, particularly recommendation 8, which speaks to institutional responsibilities to accredit like learning about anti-Indigenous racism. And I think at least the WHRI has formalized our commitments to addressing anti-Indigenous racism in our current strategic plan with priority number 4, advancing Indigenous women's health across the province. And then the other 2 reports speak a little bit more specifically to resource extraction, displacement, and gender-based violence. And I would like to relate or expand how we relate to resource extraction, displacement, and harm into the realm of knowing, as I will be relating to that throughout our presentation today. So much of what will be addressing today and speaking to today is underpinned by my commitments to transparency and vulnerability. So here's a little bit more about me in addition to what Shanley had shared at the beginning. This photo is of where I was born. Not literally, although our family lore is that my mother went into labor at this beach. But I'm specifically from Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. Gran Canaria is one of the islands of the Canary Island archipelago, located off the coast of southern Sahara and Morocco, and belonging to Spain. I immigrated to what is currently known as Edmonton when I was almost 12. I've also included a triángulo canario. It's the other image that you see there, which is a symbol believed to signify balance and connection with place. And its geography is commonly associated with, I mean, it's commonly seen throughout the islands in the original people's artwork, and believed to signify or to kind of reflect how pre-colonial inhabitants of the islands related to nature. And so I wanted to couple this symbol with this photo because I spent probably conservatively 50% of my upbringing at this beach. And the water feels like an old friend, one of those friendships that it doesn't matter how long you've been without seeing each other, when you are together, it feels the same. And so while my sense of belonging is fragmented by the distance, it's brought back into balance when I'm there, because in that water I feel home. So today's session is to engage you in thinking about, well, understanding, hopefully, and thinking about the value of reflexivity, relationality, and embodiment in how we work collaboratively with one another. So I'll be going over through some of the definitions and the practices and opportunities to integrate these concepts. And if you feel a little overwhelmed or a little uncertain, that's okay, because we're in it together, because it was overwhelming for me to put this all together. These are big things to consider. There's a lot of caveats that I had to really rein myself in from bringing in. But my personal goal is to keep things coming back to our work at the WHRI and the BCCHR, relating the concepts and practices to our strategic goals, our visions, our values, and hopefully in that way, what I share with you today feels resonant. I also just want to acknowledge the fact that I will be referring to some notes that I have because this is a lot, and also I feel nervous. Okay, so before we tuck into what collaboration is, and how it can be facilitated, I thought it would be worth situating ourselves, and identify how collaboration is a key element in both of our strategic plans. It is valued as a facilitator in working together towards excellence. And this is significant because our strategic plans are kind of these guideposts in our workplace cultures. And my hope is that by the end of this session, you may feel more curious than confused, and that the ways that you work collaboratively are supplemented. So oftentimes when we think about collaboration, we conceive of it as working with people external to our core teams. But today I'll be focusing on the collaborations that happen on the day-to-day within our teams, and the collective decisions and the individual actions that we make toward realizing our goals. The prefix co is Latin, meaning together, jointly, with, and laborate comes from laborare, which is to work, labor, toil. I like to think of it as co-elaborate, as elaborate or elaborare means to work out. So co-elaborate means to work out together. And in my view, that's essentially what we're doing. We endeavor to work together on how to improve things. So our values can be greatly supported by collaborations. While it's important for each of us to have personal commitments to our values, it is also really important to nurture understanding of our values together so we can build shared systems of accountability to these values. And collaboration isn't without its challenges because at the end of the day, it's us working together, and that's complicated. At the Ultimately, what that means is that we have to spend time reconciling differences among us, accounting for biases, addressing hierarchical structures, and building tolerance for the contradictions that are negotiated when we're in spaces between worlds of what's being compelled from within us and what's being motivated from external to us. So ultimately, collaboration requires us to learn about, from, and with ourselves and each other. Experts suggest that the process of building a culture of collaboration is quite organic. It's just that it requires commitment and practices to be able to nurture this culture. So, what I'm proposing today is that reflexivity, relationality, and embodiment can support the culture of humility and respect needed to move toward our goals in ways that do align with our collective values. So, this slide will come up relatively often because it'll be a little prompt of this is where we're moving to next. So we're going to start off with reflexivity, but I'm also just going to give a brief little intro to each of these elements. We've covered collaboration. Reflexivity is the set of practices that enable us to critically reflect on who we are and how that influences what we do. Relationality is the idea that we understand things through relationships with them. And embodiment is the notion that how we are is shaped through our body's interactions with the world. So basically, the identities that we embody distance and or approximate us from understanding each other and from aligning our priorities. We're habituated to working in certain ways within certain contexts, and these concepts and their accompanying practices can supplement how we work such that we can understand each other better and align ourselves more. So reflexivity allows us to account for our positionalities, which are where and how we're located within our social worlds. So this means that it's quite context dependent. How you are positioned in one place may not be the same as another place, or how you're positioned relative to one person may not be the same as another person, and so on and so forth. And so, but ultimately, we are still, our context is heavily governed by the colonial structures that we are operating within that center power and privilege and create the other. So it's important to still acknowledge that. And really, what we want with reflexivity is to be transparent about our position, not to center colonial dynamics, but rather to account for, as Cuban French writer Anais Nin once said, we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. So, and in addition to that, how we are and perceive each other is shaped by our positionalities. So the practice of reflexivity is meant to extend beyond acknowledgments into a set of actions that account for our influences in what we do, how we do them, why we do them, and ultimately what we want to accomplish together. And these actions can sustain the humility and accountability in our collaborations that center connection over isolation. Reflexivity is really best done with each other reflexivity should be relational and it should be practiced collectively rather than isolatedly because we have because ultimately our positionalities are built in relationship with one another. So being able to reflect with one another builds much more richness into the understandings that we have of ourselves and each other. So not only can this build systems of accountability into how we work with one another, but also set foundations for repair for when we need that in our collaborations. Okay, so like I said, reflexivity is not an isolated type of practice. Um, it is a personal journey, but it's one that requires relationality and embodiment. But I'm going to be tucking into relationality first. So, knowing is fundamentally relational, and relationality is rooted in place. And place can be defined as a concrete location that's usually imbued with meaning shaped by social, cultural, political type of processes. So, in our case, working here as part of these institutes, we're working within British Columbia, within health research and care, and towards specific goals. So those are our places. And our team's collaborations are dedicated to improving healthcare access and health outcomes. So it's important to account for that in terms of how we identify, describe, and move toward our goals. Collaboration depends on us being able to work with one another, which means that being able to locate ourselves within place and among the land is important, particularly since land plays an active role in our relational processes and is something that we ought to consider in terms of how we are in the world relationally. Right? Like personally, I'm an immigrant to this land. And so how I am here is from this immigrant related type of experience. Relationally, I relate quite differently to this land than if I had been born here. Um, and now that I've been here for so long, I relate differently to my homeland. So, with that, also, relationality is anchored in time and space. So, our practices, actions, and commitments will evolve and shift over time. And as well as how we relate with them and how we relate with one another in sustaining them and moving towards our goals. So here's where reflexivity serves to name what requires tending to. And when we do this together, we can expand the sense making for tending to it together. So we've covered how reflexivity is relational. Now we're moving into embodiment. Because embodiment is rooted in commitments to the refusal of fragmenting knowledge into categories of worthiness, like how knowledge of the mind, intellectualization, cognitive thinking, particularly in research spaces and academics, is very valued, whereas the knowledge of the body is not necessarily as valued. And so how can we remediate that? And how can we challenge perspectives in terms of what is worth paying attention to, which is what reflexivity does. It's this inherently humble, critical reflection of what do we value and why, and what's worth paying attention to, and why do we believe that. So, thinking about our values beyond espousing them externally, embodiment facilitates our integration of them such that our work is imbued with their meaning. So that moves our mind into conversation with our body. Embodiment guides consciousness beyond cognition and intellectualization, what could be referred to as disembodied theorizing, toward acknowledgments of how our bodies experience and respond to the world. Our bodies sense knowing, our bodies feel dynamics. It's worth being aware of our body's emotional and experiential labor, and it's worth getting curious about that. In our structured workplaces and the roles that we embody within our collaborative relationships, it's worth noticing when our body feels the pull between the worlds of the institutional and the own self, or within the personal and the collective, or even the mind and the body. Our bodies feel resistance to conflict. Our bodies feel compelled towards leaning into something. And our bodies reconcile that for us all of the time. They're very adept at reconciling dualities. And they teach us about building tolerance for contradictions. And for this, I'm going to refer to this image by Alexa Black from the collection Nepantla, inspired by queer Chicana feminist Gloria E. Ansaldúa. Nepantla refers to the feeling of in-betweenness among people who live being other. And the major arcanum 6 symbolizes or invites into reflections of unifying opposites and building tolerance for contradictions. And Alexa, very much in the development of these images, practiced these reconciliations of these tensions between dualities of in-betweenness, of other and wholeness and connectedness. And she co-created each image with collaborators. Collaborators self-selected into the archetype that they wanted to embody and the location in which they wanted to embody it. And collaborators embodied themselves multiple intersecting identities, such that each image is meant to evoke explorations of identity, power, and transformation through the framework of cartomancy or tarot. And this cultivated connections among identity, place, and meaning in ways that transformed fragmentation into wholeness. So I bring this up mostly as an invitation to reflecting on how we can make connections within ourselves and among each other relative to the places we work and the goals that we're working toward together. The projects we engage in are shaped by who we are as individuals and as a collective. And correspondingly, we are shaped by working together and working on these projects in this place at this time. So accountability to our goals requires us to move beyond this intellectualization and this over-intellectualization of self-awareness and towards practices that are embodied and relational and reflexive to create collaborations that are humanizing and just. And at this point, you may be feeling a little overwhelmed. So I invite us to take a little breath before moving into a bit of the how that I'm offering today. So generally speaking, when I work with teams, and a reminder, I'm a qualitative specialist, so I'm working with people who are conducting qualitative methods. And so that looks a little different. That being said, or it may look a little different to what you do. That being said, I think every team can benefit from these types of practices. Now, foundational among them is establishing these reflexive practices as a team and the conventions of doing that together. And so oftentimes I will offer a reflexivity and positionality session. And that just is an opportunity for me to be able to facilitate this level of vulnerability with people. I think particularly because there are already structures in place within teams, and these types of processes really require not only like a cooperative type of nature to them, but they also require leadership to normalize kind of the vulnerability of reflexivity and the kind of the tolerance for the uncertainty of like, what are we doing? We don't really know what we're doing. And that's okay, because really that's what reflexivity is. It's about exploring all of that uncertainty. And by doing it together, you can establish the certainty of knowing that you have each other through it. And then, of course, foundational aspect to being able to do this is to invest in your own learning of the structures that are at play that we need to account for to be able to meet each other with wholeness and connectedness. And then I offer some ongoing practices. So a project diary oftentimes is your own individual ongoing practice of reflexivity. Oftentimes it's referred to as memoing. Um, and this is a space where you can really articulate to yourself kind of some of the noticings that you're having throughout the work that you're doing. Whereas a collective memo is a space where you as a team can really track all of the collective noticings that you're making that you need to account for as you continue to work together. And I'll tuck into that a little bit more in the next slide. Then in terms of like maintaining the relationality, and which is necessary to sustain the vulnerability of meeting each other continuously in your sense making, is regular meetings. So those can be working meetings, those can be checkpoints. That's really up to you in terms of what feels like makes sense. And then opportunities to connect beyond the having to do and just for the being. So here's an example of what I will be sharing a screenshot of what a collective memo can kind of look like. But really, the utility of a collective memo is that it's a space for us to be able to track our sense making, and that it's this asynchronous means of communicating our observations, our considerations, and our decisions as we continuously work towards our goals together. And really, like the pitch for it, if you need to go to leadership about it and be like, hey, I think this is a good idea, is that it's a centralized place for all of these noticings, which means that it really cuts down on having to track all of the different emails, all of the different chats, all of the different meeting notes, all of the things, because it's mostly in one place. And you can set the convention of before you tuck into the work, make sure you've read the collective memo. It's also a place where you learn to articulate your sense making which is really worthwhile for once it comes to reporting. And you not only have tracked all of the instances where there were lessons learned and there were resolutions and there were next steps or key insights, but also the expansion of your sense making of like how you've interpreted everything throughout, landing you at this place where you know and consider much more than where you were at the outset. So it's also a wonderful place where you can then retroactively reflect on how far you've come as individuals and as a team. Um, so it really lends itself well not only to efficiency, but also to alignment and momentum of your work. So, how can you set one up? Generally speaking, you create a document in a shared space, hopefully online, because that's what would make it asynchronous, because you can be in there together at the same time as well. So personally, I tend to use OneDrive, but I understand that some people don't have access to that. So hopefully there is another avenue that you could use. And then you agree on the conventions and the conduct, and then you use it as this kind of collective meeting space for your ideas and thoughts and noticings. And so here's a screenshot of just how easy that can be. This is the one that we had established for our analysis team for the Her BC initiative. And this is how succinct our conventions were. And ultimately, this is the centralized space that we inhabited for months and lent itself to our ability to then be able to very confidently assert the trustworthiness of our analyses because of the because of the intercoder consensus that we had established throughout these entries. So these are my kind of key takeaways. I do want to acknowledge the fact that what I've shared with you today is limited by who I am, what I've been exposed to, what I have exposed myself to, as well as, endeavoring to align this with how we work here and with supplementing how collaboration is done from a micro to a macro level. And basically what I'm hoping is that really what I've managed to do, and I don't know, so you'll have to let me know, is that that I've been able to convey the value of how these practices can create cultures within teams that are open and vulnerable and constructive and accountable, um, wherein, you know, uncertainty is okay. And that ultimately you have the confidence of knowing that you're in it together. That being said, there's also the richness of knowing that in doing it together, you'll continuously be learning with each other. Um, yeah. And then I'm gonna modify a little bit how I refer to this. Maybe not so much calls to action, maybe some opportunities here. Um, uh, because, like I said, kind of at the outset, beyond this disembodied theorizing of critical self-awareness, which isolates the concepts that I've shared today in our minds, when we can embody collaboration, um, we can integrate the knowledge and the experiences that we have, and we can practice the vulnerability of the learning with and amongst one another, then we can more readily mobilize the ways that we need to work together towards our goals in ways that affirm our value and our values. So, an invitation here is that if your research aligns with our institutional values, that your teamwork can as well. And like I said, in the foundational aspects of the processes, learning is integral to that. So here are some opportunities for further learning. And then if you are a little overwhelmed, which is understandable, or would just like to get in touch, please don't hesitate to do so. Generally speaking, this is what I do. The things that are encircled in green are where kind of my services are concentrated. I also have a page on the website that provides internal and external resources concerning qualitative research, which includes these types of practices. And then I'd like to invite you to participate in the Slido. So I'm actually just going to stop sharing this screen and go to the Slido, as that's where I would like to invite you all into some reflections and some questions. That visible there? That's affirming. Thank you to whoever's agrees. Also kind of telling that it's a one word. One word, one entry. People are mulling it over. Ah. This is ultimately a labor of love. Absolutely. Yes. It's worth bringing in um the personal. At the end of the day, you know, um hopefully that's something that can be facilitated. Hopefully that's something that's welcomed, and hopefully like one would think that that would supplement not only the work that you are doing, but also your sense of worth in the work that you're doing. Okay. I might be able to flip back and forth. So maybe I'll move on to the next one, and um, I can always come back to this one if anybody's kind of left wanting to add anything else. Okay, for the collective memo, generally speaking, they were notes about because that one specifically was about the qualitative data analysis. So it started off very much about like what we were anticipating, what our expectations were, what our motivations were, what our trepidations were, very reflexively thinking about that. And then as we were getting familiar with the data, putting in observations about like, oh, I think this is a code, or I think later on coming back to a code that we'd already named and described and saying, actually, now that I've gone further into the data, I'm thinking about it this way. What do you all think? It's like, oh, okay, well, then if we need to address that, then now we all need to reorient in terms of how we move forward. So those types of considerations that rather than waiting for when we have a meeting together to talk it out, being able to suss it out in that space together. Okay. Yeah, more examples. Absolutely. Practicing the how examples. So the personal the like project diary, very similar to the collective memo, except for kind of more of an individualized practice. But what that does allow you to do is not only be able to keep track of how you're making sense of things, but then when you are in a collaborative environment that you're able to actually resource what you had thought and how you had articulated it in the moment and bring it forward and be able to kind of defend it in that space um, from this very kind of integrated way. And then let me just have a look. And then the regular meetings, usually what those are is meant to be like working meetings where you're making a lot of decisions. Thankfully, though, if you have the collective memo, it's more so, it can be more efficient because you've already talked about it and you can refer to that space and then make decisions a little bit in a way that feels really entrenched into that collective sense making and maintains that alignment and momentum. And then the opportunities to connect, I mean, that can be really look for that can look like anything really, depending on your team, depending how accessible being together is, and what that can look like. But you know, sometimes it can simply be like after you've had a meeting, if it falls around like lunchtime or coffee time, that you can after the meeting be like, do you want to have lunch together or do you want to go for a coffee together? Something like that. It doesn't have to be formal. But it's just an opportunity to be yourselves with one another in a way that isn't within a role. Mm. Very interesting question about checking personal biases around values and work respectfully within hierarchical structures, even if we don't naturally align with them. Very curious question. I think that, firstly, it's important that you acknowledge this tension and also that you tend to how your body responds to these tensions when you're in this place experiencing this misalignment and work to reconcile them. So that can look like things that you do outside of work. That could look like things that you do inside of work. And sometimes that can be deeply relational in the sense that you find ways to be within your work and within your like with your colleagues in ways that do feel affirming of your personal values. However, that can be really hard. And hopefully the idea is that if you all establish a relationship where you're critically reflexive with one another, that you're able to understand one another a little better, how one another think, how one another communicate, and you're able to align a little bit better there. So you will be able to find commonalities and connections there that reconcile these types of misalignments otherwise. Um, but I'm happy to take this conversation offline or follow up at some point with another conversation or some more resources. But I do recommend that you have a look at the webpage that I recommend that I've developed on the WHRI website. And I also have the slide deck has some references that you can have a look at as well. I'll put them up after we've finished going through the Slido. Um, Yes, more about learning, practicing reflexivity, absolutely. And again, those are available website references. Yeah. But I know that it's difficult to know where to begin. And oftentimes having prompts is helpful. So I can certainly facilitate that as well. Also, the WHRI Beyond the Binary initiative, the guides there have information on reflexivity and principles and practices, as well as links to um, like invitations to reflexivity and like worksheets and things like that. So I recommend that you have a look for that as well. Thank you for these. Yeah, I thought of all of the ongoing practices, the kind of collective memo was, well, actually, thankfully for a conversation that I had with Nicole Presley, the collective memo seemed like the most like would be received well among this group. I think it is one of those things that is like it makes the most sense as well if we're talking about reflexivity and relationality that it would be something that is a collective activity. Okay. Well, I'm mindful of the time. The Slido will remain open, but I am going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to go back to the presentation only briefly just to um, give a chance to people to have a look at some of those references and so forth. So here are some of the references that I brought into the presentation today. And if anybody has any other questions that I did not prompt with the Slido, please feel free to ask them. We have just a little bit of time for those.
Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see the engagement on Slido. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to drop into the chat? You have Julia's contact information on this slide here, so you know how to get a hold of her. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you so much, Julia. Just want to quickly flag for everyone that the January Lunch and Learn session will be on the 21st of January, and it's on new processes for electronic program utilization at Children's and Women's Hospital that are being rolled out. It's called IRAP, so that stands for Institutional Research Approvals Portal. So hope that you'll join us for that if you're involved in submitting program utilization forms on campus. So thank you so much, everyone, and happy holidays.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.